And so thank you, ladies. Thank you for joining us. If you don't have your video camera on, we're very pleased to see your lovely faces. So please turn it on if you like. If you're calling in on the phone, no worries. Just thanks for joining us. We're so excited to be here with Min this month. We read Pachinko, which was one of our longer books, I will admit, but absolutely phenomenal. Such great feedback, so much social media love out there for the book. And we feel very fortunate to be here with the author tonight. And I'm going to let you, before we break into questions, and everybody who wants to ask a question, there is a chat channel on the right-hand side, just a little admin here. So you can always type your questions if you're not feeling brave enough to ask it live. But there is also a functionality on Zoom that lets you raise your hand. So if you'd prefer to raise your hand and ask it live, then that is absolutely welcome. And you'll see very shortly how welcoming our author is and how outgoing. And I'm sure she'll make you feel very comfortable. So I'm going to pass it over to you now. And if you just want to tell us a little bit about your book and maybe the writing process, then that would be a great opener.
Well, good evening. It's it's 8 o'clock in New York City, and you are looking at my incredibly messy office. I'm about to move to Boston, so it's like papers are everywhere. I'm actually not a hoarder. So and you might need to come and rescue me from all my piles. So I've been on tour for about 1 year and 8 months now, and I'm going to probably finish at the end of June. I've been on tour forever. This is my first Zoom book club, so thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Girly Book Club. I think it's such a cool idea to have a global book club and then for you guys to be reading. Thank you very much. As for this book, I'm really surprised even now to meet you guys because I didn't think I would sell the book. I wrote the book. I got the idea for the book in 1989. I started an entire manuscript and finished it between 1996 to 2003. And then it was so bad that I forgot about it and I started another book because I got really depressed at how bad it was. And then I moved to Japan in 2007 because my husband got a job. So my family, we moved there. And then I started to interview the Korean Japanese, and I learned that I was totally wrong about the entire history of the Koreans in Japan. They were not just victims. They're really fierce and interesting and compassionate. And they also loved Japan, which I thought was interesting. Like, Japan didn't want them there, but they really loved the country. And then you just realize that immigration and migration is so complex, and I had to keep doing more interviews in order to understand the story. I threw away the entire first manuscript and I started all over again. And then I wrote about exactly one family and 4 generations, and that's what eventually became Pachinko. When I finished selling Pachinko, I was so happy because I was done. More than anything else, I was just really happy because I couldn't work on this book anymore. It took me most of my life. I turned 50 this year, so it took most of my life to write this book. I'm happy to take any questions.
So you wrote a book before that. So Free Food for Millionaires. That was your first book, correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And is that like that? Is it a large book or?
Longer than Pachinko.
Oh, wow. So let me just get the timeline straight here. You wrote the beginning of Pachinko and then you took a break and then you finished it.
I wrote an entire manuscript.
Okay.
And then I put it aside, and then I wrote Free Food for Millionaires. I published that, and then after that I went back to work on Pachinko, which wasn't called Pachinko, that was called Motherland.
Okay, and just to go back even further, you actually were a lawyer before you decided to go full-time as a writer.
Yeah, I was a lawyer for 2 years. I was really good. I was like a really neurotic, careful corporate lawyer.
So was it the move, like your husband's move to Japan, that decided to put that all, like, change kind of the course of your life, or was it just your love of writing?
Oh no, I'm sorry. When I was a kid, I found out that I was a chronic hepatitis B carrier, and I was asymptomatic, and then I became really sick. And then when I was working as a lawyer, I was working way too much. And then I decided to quit because I thought that being a writer would be much easier.
Was that the case?
Well, I mean, you can control your hours much better, but I think that I work really, really hard now, primarily because marketing is so different now for selling books than it used to be. So I'm learning a lot about how writers work. Like modern writers aren't, it's really weird. If you talk to writers who are out there, they're writing, but then they're also having to spend a lot of time like sharing the book with their audience. And I like meeting the readers. Everything else is kind of weird. Just that part is like, you just feel so lucky to have them. But I think the other parts are, it feels like work.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so now I've got it. I think I've got it all straight in my head now. So this,
It's a weird timeline because I was a lawyer and then I became a writer, but I really became a failed writer. I didn't publish my first book until after 12 years of quitting being a lawyer. So it wasn't like, I was a lawyer and then I became a writer. It's like, no, I became a lawyer and I became an apprentice and then I published a book in 2007.
and what sort of reception? I mean, you've got such great reception for Pachinko, but what kind of reception did Free Food for Millionaires kind of meet with?
Oh, it sold really well. And it's taught in a lot of universities. So it was a top 10 books for the Times of London. It was a top 10 books for USA Today and top 10 for like Fresh Air and NPR. So it did have that, and it got great reviews. But then I didn't publish another book for another 10 years. So I don't know. I think I probably didn't, like, people always say you're supposed to strike where the iron's hot kind of thing. I didn't do that. Like, I don't know how to publish a book every year. I don't know how to do that. I would like to be that kind of author, but I'm not.
I mean, I think that those are, I mean, not to take anything away from those authors, but there's certainly it's a very formulaic. I mean, you see some of the authors that can do it every year, and you can see that they follow a certain formula. Having said that, I do have a question here, and it's from Jennifer, and she says, what made you decide to write this as a generational tale versus focusing on one of the characters' life only?
Oh, well, my first version of the book, it was just one generation. So the first version of the book called Motherland, the one I wrote between 1996 and 2003, it was one generation. And it was about Solomon. So you know that now Solomon's about like this percent of the book. And when I went to Japan, I interviewed all these sort of Solomon types of people who are Wall Street bankers and stuff, and they were so boring. And I was like, oh, that's why that book sucks so bad. So I decided that in order to understand Solomon, you have to really understand the first generation. And that made me write a historical novel, which I did not want to do. It's so difficult. It takes so much time to figure out 100 years of history. And because I was a history major, I took it so seriously because I thought, oh, if I get this wrong, I'm in big trouble because somebody will like call me out.
Oh, I can appreciate that for sure.
I worry a lot about being wrong.
Well, any historical author, I think that, and I mean, there's always lots of notes in the back to make sure that they're covering their. Next question I have for you is there's a interview with you about the Bible, and I was wondering if you could kind of tell our members a little bit about how that influenced you.
Yeah, it's so weird because when I first started writing fiction, I didn't know how to start. And also I don't have an MFA. So I'm totally like kind of self-taught, and I took a lot of cheap classes here and there in community centers. So I quit being a lawyer, and I didn't have any money, but I had all this time. So I would read all the newspapers. I read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Financial Times, and I knew everything. But then like it didn't help me write fiction at all. It just made me like worried. Like a lot of news makes people worried, and it's really true. So then I read that Willa Cather, who's one of my favorite writers, used to read a chapter of the Bible every day. I didn't even know if she was a Christian or whatever. Like she was kind of like a radical feminist woman who was from the Midwest in America and then lived in New York. I think she was gay. I don't know. So she was reading the chapter of the Bible. So I decided I would start that. And I did. And it really helped me because I started to understand all this. I think I started to understand Western literature in a really different way because the great classics use the Bible so much. So I started to understand patterns of stories that I had never known before, and I love it. So I have done it now for 23 years.
Wow.
I have read the Bible like as a loop, maybe I think 6 times.
Oh my goodness. That's incredible.
and it's great. Like, I know all these weird arcane facts that I don't even know why I know, but I'm really glad I do now. So it's wonderful.
It must actually, like I mean, like you said, there's so much stuff based on the Bible that it must give you such insight into things that we would not normally even realize where they came from, or.
Oh, completely. And also at this point in, like, an English major, as a culture, we're so biblically illiterate. We don't actually know all those things in the same way. Like, we don't know that much mythology anymore,
Right.
that we don't understand how to interpret what that author had intended 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. So I find it to be a real strength.
Oh, wow. That's
But I'm
incredible.
also a Presbyterian, so it doesn't upset me to read the Bible. Maybe for some people who might not want to. I don't know if I would encourage anyone to do it. I think it's very helpful.
Before we dive into your question, Cassandra, I'm just going to ask Min a couple questions about her past, because obviously your background plays a role in this story. You were born in Seoul, and so you were born in Korea, but you moved over to the States when you were 7. So I know you moved to Japan with your husband you were there for 5 years?
4 years.
4 years. So was it that move that really made you decide to write about the history of Koreans in Japan as opposed to maybe Koreans in Korea?
Oh, I had always intended to write about Koreans in Japan, and that's why I had written that other bad book. But then because I was in Japan anyway, I figured, why didn't I just take a stab at it again? And then I decided to do it. And then it was so helpful just to kind of see everything. It's one thing to read about the history, because I read so many different academic books about this group. But then when I moved to Japan, it felt really faded. It really felt faded. And I felt more empowered to write this story.
Okay.
I'm not normally someone who says you have to go visit a place to write about it, but now that I've had that experience, I kind of think, what an opportunity that I had.
And your first book, can you just tell us, because you're also talking about the Korean culture in that book.
Yeah, well,
I'm
writing a trilogy.
Right, okay.
So I'm writing a diaspora trilogy. It's called The Koreans. So The Free Food for Millionaires is about Koreans in America. And it's a 20th century story. And then you have Koreans in Japan and Pachinko. And the next book is called American Hagwon. And a Hagwon is a tutoring center that Korean kids go to after school. And in South Korea right now, if you're age 4, something's happening here.
Sorry, go ahead.
If you're a 4-year-old kid in South Korea, 80% of 4-year-old kids in South Korea start going to tutoring centers for supplemental education.
Oh, wow.
So I'm writing about that phenomenon of stressing education so strongly in a culture, and how when you have Koreans all over the planet, they still have the same ethos of education, and I wanted to write about it. It's going to be a novel.
Okay, and when you say a trilogy, it's not in the traditional sense in that there's a continuation of character.
No, it's much more about a theme that I'm really exploring, and it's about this Korean group within the 20th century and the 21st century a little bit.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And when can we expect this next book?
I don't know. I'm working at it now. I just got funded this year, so I have these 2 fellowships. So for the first time in my life, I've never been funded before. I'll be able to just work on this book, which will be kind of cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, Cassandra, I'm sorry I paused there, but Cassandra has asked a very specific question. She actually sent it to me as well before. So reading this book, I would definitely consider Sunja to be a feminist pioneer of her time. One of the challenges for Sunja was the way her actions posed against the way she was conditioned to think and behave. Was it intentional to show how confident she was in her convictions despite gendered injustices?
Wow, what a great question. It was intentional for her to end up becoming a feminist hero. However, I think a lot of people are feminist heroes without intending to become that way, because circumstances make you realize that you have no choice but to work really hard. So you may be trained to not work very hard, but then all of a sudden, if poverty ends up in your doorstep, you may decide that you want to eat. So what would you do? Like, I think there are so many people around the world right now who are doing things they didn't intend to do in order to take care of their families. And I think that Sanja was put into a situation where she did want to take care of her sons and her husband, and she ended up doing a lot of work and becoming more resourceful. Like, that's something that really has surprised me about people who are illiterate and who don't have money and without connections and power, is that if they want to survive, they are doing so many adaptive things. And I'm curious, like, what we would be like if all of a sudden we were plucked from our comfortable lives and like put somewhere where we don't speak we don't speak the language, so making us functionally illiterate in that language. We don't have connections and we don't have money. What would we do? And to me, that was the challenge of seeing all these people who had ended up in this country.
Okay. Ladies, if you have a question and you want to ask it live, you're absolutely welcome to. There is a functionality that allows you to raise your hand. Or you can always just type it in the right-hand corner, and we can ask it that way as well. If you're on the phone, you can email it to me, and I can ask it. It's info@thegirlybookclub.com. So I'm going to go to your opening line because it's very interesting. But the way the book opens, history has failed us, but no matter. Can you talk a little bit about, first of all, did you write that from day one, or was that something that you went back and added?
Oh, I was back and added it.
Okay.
Because my book has a thesis statement. So history has failed us, but no matter is my thesis statement about the condition of the world. Since I'm a very ambitious person, I think that all of us feel that history has failed us. And I wanted to say that even when history fails all of us, and almost it's failed pretty much all women, and it's failed pretty much every poor person in the world. And it certainly has failed every illiterate person in the world, because the way historians work is that they have to have primary documents in order to record a history. So if you are more illiterate.
Sorry, just a second. There we go.
And what ends up happening is that history does fail you. It doesn't remember you. It doesn't care about you. And what I wanted to say is that in my experience of all my research is that you can be poor, illiterate, ignored, and unimportant, and yet you adapt and you figure out how to create a life for yourself and your family. And very often when you look at people today who seem really successful, they come from generations of people who were not terribly powerful. And I wanted to talk about that. So the no matter part is really important, because I do feel a sense of defiance with people around the world who are disempowered. There is a defiance, and I really like that.
Kind of bearing that in mind, just looking at the book as a whole, and like telling us that you started with Solomon originally, but really, I mean, the book is really, like you said, he's only such a small fraction of the actual book. But like, and like Cassandra was saying about it being, I mean, you have two kind of really strong, dominant female, well, actually three, I would say, characters in the book. So it must have, I mean, it's changed so much from when you first started writing that I just wonder, you were talking about it a little bit before everybody else logged on, but like how you write such an epic novel and how you write such a family saga.
Well, I didn't intend to, but it became so much more fun for me to explore these stories. So the kind of writer that I am is that I would like to write a book. When I approach writing a book, I would like to write about every single person. Then it wouldn't just be about one person. It wouldn't just be about me. It wouldn't just be about Erin. It'd be about Erin and me and every person on this call. And also, how do we interact with each other? What are the themes that connect us? What are the themes that make us have conflicts? And that would make, for me, the kind of landscape that I'm interested in. I like big panoramas. I need them in order for me to understand. And I'm not that interested in writing about it's not interesting enough for me to work on for a long time. Because I like being surprised. People are very surprising. I never take anyone at face value. I mean, just because I've done too many interviews, people have been so surprising that I'm very careful around what people say.
Fair enough. That's probably wise words. Just looking back, and you left your career when you were 7. So how much did you know about the treatment of Koreans in Japan? I mean, I feel like a lot of people said during the reading of this book that like it's a time period that I knew nothing about.
I knew nothing. I knew absolutely nothing. So when I was 19, I went to a lecture and I learned a little bit about them. And then I became sort of intrigued. So then I became more open to learning more about them. And then when I quit being a lawyer in 95, I quit being a lawyer in 95, I thought, oh, maybe. So I started to accumulate all this academic research, but even the academic research in 95 wasn't that huge. It was probably like you could find 20 books. Whereas if you said to yourself, oh, I'm going to write a book about World War II, you'd have libraries filled with books, about World War II. So Good luck. So for me, I felt like, okay, I can sort of understand this universe. I could read the immigration laws and the history, and I can sort of understand it. But then I don't think I really, really got it until I moved to Japan and I met the people. And then I was like, oh, they're so different from the Korean Americans. Like Korean Americans and the Korean Japanese, very different. And that was kind of cool too for me to know. In the same way, if you go to Koreans are very different from Korean Americans. And I think that was interesting to me as somebody who came to America as a child. I was just more curious about people that I knew and that I would meet and think, well, we're supposed to have something in common, but we're different. Why is that? And what made us different?
Have you ever read Americana by any chance?
No, I have not. This is Chimamanda, right?
Yes, yeah. That's right. Yeah.
I heard it's great.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's excellent. That you just reminded me of her when you were talking. So I just wondered. Can you tell us a little bit? I do have another question, actually. Let me ask this from Jennifer. She said she went to book club this month, and she said, in my chapter's discussion, we were curious about Sanja's internal relationships with Christianity. Early in her marriage, she seemed to have very little understanding of it. And once Isaac was arrested, this was not explored as much. Can you talk about Sanja's relationship with faith and how this relates to developing the plot?
I think that's a really great question, because I wanted to explore Christianity from a point of view of somebody who didn't know what Christianity was. What Christians are, we have several hundreds of years of understanding how it affects you. So if you become an agnostic or an atheist, you have a pretty reasoned point of view as to why you are those things, or if you are somebody of faith. And I think for me, Sanja has to experience Christianity from this person. So Ishak in many ways embodies Christianity, and he is actually a good person. Although there are Christians in this book who I think are not necessarily great people. And I think for me that was a metaphor of how countries that are exposed to missionaries and Western Christianity and how they can respond to these people. I think after Ishak passes away, Sanja has to sort of accept that this was part of her life, but I don't necessarily think that she became somebody who's really devoted as a Christian. I do see somebody, I think for her, the experience of Christianity was more personal, embodied in a person, as opposed to a person, like a metaphysical quest on her part. Because some people will say, oh, I want to learn more about Buddhism, I want to learn more about Judaism, I want to kind of figure this out. She wasn't that person. For her, it was really a matter of meeting somebody who was a Christian, and she decided, oh, he's a good person. And I think, to me, that's a really good illustration of what G.K. Chesterton said, the reason why he doesn't like Christians. No, the best reason why not to be a Christian is because of Christians. Because even though he's a Christian, he didn't like so many of the ones that he met. And I always found that to be a really interesting idea that, oh, if you meet somebody of a certain faith and they turn out to be a jerk, would you reject that faith? And so for Sanja, she met a Christian who ended up being a very good person. So I think for her, she would think, okay, but does that make her a Christian? I don't know. I guess for me, I don't really think so. I think it was something that she just thought was a good idea, but not necessarily that she personally gave her heart to God.
I have a question about, and I forget his name, so you'll have to help me with him, but it's the gentleman that Sanja's with and has her first son with.
Oh, Hansu.
Right, Hansu. So I desperately wanted to like him, for 3/4 of the book. And obviously at the end, he's a disaster and there's no way around it. But obviously that was intentional, or was it planned out from the beginning?
You know, I love Hansu. He's my favorite character. People are always surprised. He's my favorite character, bar none. Like, Sun Just God doesn't hold a candle to him. And the reason why I say that is because I worked on this book for such a long time. And when you work on a book for a really long time, especially for a fiction writer, you need to have a very exciting, strong character who can oppose her. Like, Sun is a very strong character, but Hansu is a very strong character. And whenever he would appear on a page, it would make me really happy because stuff would happen. So when you read a book and when you feel like nothing happens, it's usually because you don't have strong enough characters. Very often writers get really attached to one character and everybody else becomes a kind of straw man. So you want to always avoid that in fiction. You want to have multiple strong characters. And Hansu, who is not a good guy, but he's very powerful, he's very sexy, and he fixes things. You may not like the way it ends up, but he does fix things. And I found that really appealing. I met a lot of Hansu type of people when I interviewed for this book. And whenever you're with people like Hansu, there's a kind of magnetism about them. They're highly charismatic, very appealing people, but they're very dangerous. So you have to be kind of careful around them, because they can destroy you, and they have an intention to destroy you. It's almost like they're kind of pulling you into their lair. So you have to really be careful of all that energy that's so appealing. But it was really fun to write about him.
It was just frustrating because I wanted him to be like the White Knight, and obviously he wasn't. But Sanja talks about how a woman's life is supposed to be difficult, and it's like, well, it wouldn't have to be if you would let him help you, because he's really a great guy, but clearly he was not.
Well, I went to one book club, and this woman was saying how much she was in love with Hansu. And all these other women in the room were like, no, he's a bad guy, And you know, the woman who's in charge of the book club, she's like, well, I think he was having a bad night, the night when he stuffed that young woman. I was like, no, he's a bad guy.
The title, can we talk about that for a second? A lot of people don't know what it means. I didn't know what it meant when I picked up the book. I had to look it up, but and you actually had a different name originally. So can you talk about choosing the name for the book?
So Pachinko is a adult gambling game, and it's unfair. So you're not going to win. Like you will win sometimes, but most often the house will win. Like any other gambling situation, it's rigged. It's not rigged in your favor. It's always rigged in the favor of the house. I'm arguing that life is like that. Very often, all of us have to do things in which we have a really slim shot of success, and yet we play. So I wanted to argue about the defiance and about the persistence that we need, even if we don't have a lot of power. So Pachinko becomes a central metaphor for all these characters who are kind of set up to fail, and yet they still keep going. And I found that to be very important to me. So I make that the title. Pachinko is also an industry that is dominated by ethnic Koreans. They ended up in this business, which is not considered very high class or good. Like if you said you work in the Pachinko business in Japan, people look down at you. Like they see you as a very sketchy person, a low-class person, a dirty person, criminal, corrupt. Like they have all these like metaphors around and stereotypes around what you do for a living. And those stereotypes are always imputed on the ethnic Koreans. So it became a very convenient world that I wanted to sort of explore and exhibit.
It's quite ironic seeing as there's like you talk about Christianity and the morals, and then her sons, both of them at the end of the day, go into this world.
Yeah, because I think we're all very complex. Like, I mean, you can say you work in Wall Street, or you could work in the insurance business or the pharmaceuticals, and they all sound like they're clean businesses. But we all know that there's corrupt aspects to every one of these things. You could work for higher education, and you can find out there's a corrupt aspect to it. So I find it interesting that this one business that's totally legal in Japan is considered dirty and corrupt, when in fact, they had no choice but to work in these businesses.
I just got another email from Carol, who might be on the phone line, actually. Thank you, Carol. I received your email in great time, so I'm going to read it now. And she talks about my favorite character. She writes, I love Huni. He made the strongest impression on me. Everyone loved and respected him in spite of his club foot and cleft palate. Was he based on anyone you have met personally?
Oh, I have met people from Korea and Japan who have these abilities and disabilities, and they have these physical characteristics. And I wanted to write about them in particular because in East Asia, and that can only speak really for Japan and South Korea right now, as well as China too, is that there is such discrimination against you and your family if you have this in your bloodline. So if you have a cleft palate, if you have clubfoot, if you have any kind of genetic abnormalities in your bloodline, they will discriminate against you socially and especially also in marriage. So for example, if you have suicide in your family or depression, even nearsightedness, that's considered some sort of defect. And I wanted to argue that Huni, who has these very clear manifestations of genetic abnormalities or not things that are not considered desirable, that he could be a virtuous person and he can be the progenitor, he could be the actual patriarch of an entire line. And that was important to me that we sort of think about that again, about how caring so much about blood and genes is a very dangerous idea and also morally fallacious. Like, it's not true that just because somebody is physically or biologically perfect that they're morally virtuous, because it's not connected. So that's why Huni is such a good person.
And he was loved by everybody, so that was nice.
But people get really mad that he died so quickly. I was like, yeah, I know. He was exactly for one chapter.
Talking about her Sanja's father, I want to talk a little bit about her mother, because when her mother comes to join her in the later part of the book, that's very abnormal, right? That's not what normally happens. Usually, like, she would have left and she never would have seen her mother again.
Oh, no. There were some reunions.
Were there? Okay.
Absolutely. Well, in the sense, and the thing is, everybody else didn't have that reunion, right? Like, Kyungki never saw her mother again. Or
right, yeah.
Like, all these other characters didn't see their parents, but because Hansu really wanted to impress her, he found her and he brought her. Like, you needed to have a person of Hansu's power in order to negotiate that sort of rescue and bringing her to Japan. And even then, Youngjin still didn't like him.
No chance. She knew from the beginning. She was smart.
Yeah, well, yes, she was. You know, it's interesting, right? She did have a sense about him.
But she actually seemed to, I mean, they worked really hard, but she did seem to have a relatively good life, seeing that she had the guest house.
Oh, I think she had a great life compared to the other people. Like, I think that's the irony of the Koreans in Japan. So even though they were in a country in which they were unwanted and they have been treated like second-class citizens, by having left Korea when it was at its very, very poorest, they did escape a lot of horrible things like cholera, dirty water, you know, dictatorships. Like, South Korea was a dictatorship for decades. It wasn't really a democratic nation until only about 30 years ago. So even though it was bad somewhere else, it wasn't necessarily better at home. And I think that's one of the interesting things about immigration and migration, is that it's not perfect really anywhere.
Right, and you did allude to that with her parents and everything, but it wasn't really clear exactly what they were going through.
Yeah. So because everything, the stage is mostly in Japan in that story. So we don't really know how horrible it is back in South Korea or North Korea. So that was something that I had to make that conscious decision.
Sure. I mean, yeah, otherwise it would have been another
1,800 pages.
Yeah. I do have a question about Bokhi and Dokhi.
Yes.
Do we know what happened to them in the end?
Well, they become comfort women.
Right.
And it's not something that I write about. I'm not interested in writing about comfort women, but it's something that I had to mention in terms of trying to do the entire history of the Koreans in Japan, is that many, many women became comfort women. But I didn't focus on it, but the reader would know that's what would have happened to those girls. They would have been essentially lured and then sold into prostitution. Almost all the comfort women died. There are very, very few survivors.
Wow. I do have a question here from Elaine. She's just emailed me. Thank you, Elaine. She wants to know, why did Noah commit suicide? Why did you decide to kill him as a character?
It's so funny because whenever people say you killed him, I'm like, yeah, I guess you're right. I did type that out, didn't I? Noah had to die. Noah was living a kind of death anyway. So one of the things that I'm arguing is that metaphysically speaking and metaphorically speaking, when you are not who you truly are and you are passing as another person, you are kind of living a death anyway. And he had a kind of ambivalence about who he was. And he would have planned, I believe, that eventuality of suicide because he could not face being discovered by his family. Because being Korean is so shameful in Japan. Even now, a lot of Koreans in Japan are very ambivalent about telling you that they're Korean. So even today, like if you met a person from Japan who was ethnically Korean or let's say half Korean, they don't talk about it very much. It's really the exception than the rule. They often use their Japanese names. They don't talk too much about it, and they feel culturally Japanese. And they know that if they tell someone that they are, especially if they tell a Japanese person that they're ethnically Korean, even today in 2018, they could face a kind of like, like there's like a little bit like of a pause. Like if something, they'll remember it as something negative, and you're not part of the community. Unfortunately, like it would even happen to me, which was so weird, where I would have like a totally normal interaction and someone would say something bizarro about Koreans and I'd be like, where did that come from? Unfortunately, I don't think that it's because they're Japanese. I just think that there are certain countries in the world where being pure is really important, and Japan is one of those countries. Like South Korea is not that different. So I don't think it's that the Japanese are so wrong. It's that it's the same thing when you're in, let's say, Ireland. Like I met African Americans who moved to Ireland and have children there. The Irish don't think that they're Irish. So it isn't just like, we can't always think that it's just one country. It's like actually most countries don't accept people who don't look like them to be considered part of the majority. Americans are really rare. Canadians are really rare. Australians are really rare in that way because they have a culture of immigration that's based on birth, not by blood. But most countries around the world still care about birth and blood.
Can I just add to that there, if you don't mind? So I'm Irish, so it's really funny that you said that. I lived in Ireland up to 10 years ago. I spent the last 10 years in Canada. So I totally agree with what you say as well. It really doesn't matter where you come from there, and you just feel this automatic acceptance and lack of discrimination. And now I'm living in Australia. I moved to Australia last July, and I feel the same here. In fact, although Irish people are very much embraced here, more than, so it's like a positive discrimination nearly. Right. But you're so right about Ireland. Like Irish people would like to think that they're so accepting and, we voted in gay marriage before everybody else and, but scratch the surface. Absolutely. If you're not born in Ireland, you're kind of always going to be an outsider. You could be there 60 years and you're never really going to be one of us. So I just agree with what you said there. And I'll be quiet now.
No. I think it's funny because I always think of the Irish in this incredibly positive way. And my husband's last name is Duffy, Duffy.
Oh, yeah.
He's actually Japanese. My husband is half Japanese, and he's like 2% Irish, but he's got this last name. He's mostly German, French, and all these other things, and English. But he's got this Irish last name. So, and when I went to Ireland for this book, it was incredibly well received. Like, I think Ireland was one of the first countries that really sort of took this book on. Mm-hmm. However, then I met Blacks who lived in Ireland, and they were talking about how they were born there for 2 generations, and they weren't accepted. And it was like, of course. So,
but we probably enjoy the book, but from an immigrant's point of view, we're always the ones who go away. And even the people who still live there, we all have family through generations always. Because there's always been depressions and economic downturns where we've gone. So it's part of our culture, the immigrants. And I'd say that's probably why it's of tremendous interest. But very few people emigrate into Ireland. Because
also, I think the Irish have suffered enormous persecution from England. And that was the other connection that they found with this book, is that Japan
yes,
became the parallel, and then Ireland and Korea became the other parallel, because they had suffered, you know, of having been an oppressed class. So
but ironically, the first port of call usually for the Irish immigrants was to go over to England.
Of course.
Because it was the cheapest, the easiest way. Yeah. So it was the same kind of story. So you're living amongst the oppressors. Do you know what I mean? And you're doing the navvy jobs, building the subway station, you know, all of that kind of stuff, back in, say, the 60s and things. And yet you were doing the jobs that the English didn't want to do. This is generalizing hugely, but yet you were second-class citizen. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And so anytime you have a post-colonial history, the colonized almost always go back to the colonizer, especially the ones who are the most ambitious. The most ambitious will end up going to the colonizer. So I've met people who are from Vietnam who go to France, right? All these African countries. Now they're all going back to these, you know, European countries in which countries are like, no, we don't want you. We liked it when you were there.
Yeah. But maybe it's the thing of, because you grow up of the oppressors, but they're also on a pedestal, because these are the people who have really nice lives. You know, you kind of go, oh, if only I could be them, then I'd be really well. Or if I was educated like them, or, you know, I think that's the thing. It's what you know, and you go, well, they seem to have a great life, so I'm going to try and get a bit of that for myself.
Well, that's exactly correct, because anytime you're interested in success, you have to ask yourself, who is my model of success? So if you're a colonized person, you're like, oh, the colonizer is the ultimate model of success, which means you have to ask yourself, how much of myself will I keep? How much of my family will I keep? And how much will I assimilate to become like the model? And then you end up becoming somebody that you didn't think you were going to become. So
that goes back to the question in the first place I asked about Noah, and how, you know, you're kind of answering the question there, that whilst he took on everything that he was supposed to and rejected his ethnic background, he just wasn't happy. He was just living a lie. But it was just really sad. It was really sad that he died, because I felt sorry for Sunja, because I felt her whole life did revolve around, obviously, her children, you know.
Oh, absolutely. And also, I think all parents, like, you're so vulnerable to your child's happiness. Like, I mean, I have a son who's 20 years old, and I feel so vulnerable. Like, you can hurt me. You can really hurt me in a way that's different than. Well, so I think love it makes you so vulnerable. And with kids, it's like a different kind of vulnerability that I didn't even think that it was possible.
Yeah, you're right.
I hate that. I hate feeling this vulnerable.
I know.
Thank you, Elaine. Very good questions.
Thank you for answering me.
Min, your conversation with Elaine actually made me wonder if you have received any feedback from either Koreans or Japanese on the book.
Oh yeah, at every event, usually one or two turns up, and they're incredibly happy about the fact that I wrote this book. They're very grateful. I get letters all the time, incredibly, very moving testimonials about their families and how much they felt connected with it. Because it's 4 generations, invariably, I will have gotten some aspect of all these people's lives in. And I'm so surprised. I'm like, wow, I had no idea that this group actually existed and that they would feel this way. And I feel really lucky. I mean, I do feel like I didn't waste my time. And there are a lot of times when I felt like, wow, I could have more money. I could have more power. Perhaps if I had stayed a lawyer, I could have less debt. I don't know. I think what makes me feel is that this book did seem to touch a lot of people. And that makes me feel like, well, I guess I didn't waste my time, which is kind of cool.
I mean, I know that it took quite a long time, and it was I can't even imagine spending the amount of time and I mean, writing a book of this magnitude, but I know, I mean, I hope that you know that, I mean, just from the feedback, we read books that people don't always love, and this one was very well loved, so.
Oh, thank you very much. No, I feel really grateful. I'm really grateful to all of you for reading it. I mean, when somebody buys a book, whether it costs $27 or $17, I mean, that money is a lot of money, especially from when I grew up. Like, that's a lot of money. Like, I didn't grow up with a house full of books. We always had to borrow books. So I think it's kind of like an unusual thing when people actually says, I'm going to buy this thing and it's going to be in my house. Like, that's quite radical. But the greater thing is when people give you their time. Like, when someone gives you 12 to 14 hours of their lives to you and trusts you to, like, tell you a story, I think that's an enormous thing that someone has done. So the contract between the writer and the reader is quite sacred. And I don't take that lightly. So thank you.
That's incredibly perceptive of you. That's and I think, like, historical fiction, where the best books we read are historical fiction because the girls take away something. And I mean, obviously every single passage that you wrote was well thought out, and it's so fascinating to hear about all the ways that you researched and all the effort that you spent and all the interviews that you did. I mean, it's such a work of passion for you.
It definitely was a work of passion. I'm so glad it's over. I really am.
So excited about your next book. Before, I want to leave you with one more question. We would love to hear what books inspire you, or who your favorite authors are, or.
So I can't talk about any contemporary books right now because I'm judging the National Book Award for fiction in the U.S., so I'm reading a ton of contemporary fiction, but I can't really talk about it or else I'm violating my conflict of interest and stuff. But my favorite books in the world are 19th century novels. The most important book in terms of my formation is probably Middlemarch by George Eliot, a book that most people don't like to read, but it's amazing. I think that if you wanted to read about wisdom and try to understand people, I think there are very few books that have as much wisdom in a novel about understanding people. The other book that I always recommend if you like 19th century novels is Cousin Bet by Balzac. Balzac is not widely read anymore, and I think Cousin Bet is probably one of the easiest books to read. And he does a really amazing study of women. So if you want to understand romance and sex and power, I think Cousin Bet, there are very few books that are as good as that. Recent books that I absolutely love. You know who I really love I love Anne Patchett. I like Meg Wolitzer. I like, who else is contemporary that I really like? I love Junot Diaz. I love Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. What else is really terrific? Oh, golly. There's so many amazing books out there. But yeah, I think those are probably really good ones.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that list. I hope that some of our members or watchers will pick up your recommendations.
Thank you. Oh, I also finished I've been reading Nathan Hill's The Nyx.
We read that in book club, and it was such a divided book.
What do people think of it?
I personally loved it. Absolutely, literary fiction is top on my list. But I mean, it's
long.
It's a long, hard read for some people, because if you didn't get into the characters, then you just had absolutely no interest in. Probably one of the biggest feedback was, I don't care about gaming, so I couldn't get into.
Right. So I found that interesting just because I feel like right now we're in a weird time in history where a lot of young men are kind of lost in that world. And I was just interested in what's going on in that world that all these young men feel that they can't deal with the real world and they have to be in this alternate universe. So that was very interesting to me to try to figure that out, because it's so unappealing for most women. But I just wanted to understand it.
No, absolutely. And the college student, I mean, such a social commentary book.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you so much. I won't take up any more of your time, but I would like for you to, when you have a chance after this, there's a comment from Jennifer, and she's just, it's just for you to read. So when you have a chance, please do. Otherwise, thank you, ladies, for joining us. We're going to put the recording up so that everybody can watch it after. Thank you so much for your time. As Min was discussing your time, you spent an hour with us here tonight, and we really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Good. Take care. Bye.
Bye.